which included Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, and Boeing between 1984 and 1988?
Okay, I've got to say I've never heard of that.
Okay.
The Advanced Aeronautics Company?
Yes, it was an independent company formed by those three aerospace companies, and they came together. This was a temporary arrangement between 84 and 88. They absolutely did form a branch-off organization.
Okay.
No word on that, huh?
Never even heard of that.
Yeah,
That's
it's true. It's true. I've got the paperwork, LA Times article on it.
Okay.
It was a separate organization, and they must have built something. So no clue on what that might be, huh?
Yeah, that is interesting because during the 1980s, there were undoubtedly some classified programs, and we sometimes get very small glimpses, just enough to tell us that there was a program, but not really enough to say what it was or what it did. A good example was from 1983 in the summer. There was some sort of classified advanced technology demonstrator. That's how it was described. Classified advanced technology demonstrator that was flown in the summer of 1983. And we know that a pilot named Major Frank Birk flew that aircraft at least a few times. Who built it? What was the configuration? What it was for? I don't know, and I've never been able to find anything to tell me. No designation for the aircraft, nothing.
Wasn't any kind of MiG, right?
No, this would have been something
special
just
purpose.
Completely special purpose, probably a one-off demonstrator. Whether it led to anything, you know, that was a production aircraft, I don't know.
Okay. Peter, on page 26 of the May 6, 1996 issue of Aviation Week, the following statement is made. In the past, B-2 program officials have carefully chosen their words when discussing a subscale B-2 prototype. They denied a direct prototype existed, but left open the possibility that a test bed might exist, giving the impression that it might have led to other still secret programs. Peter, did Northrop build and test fly a manned subscale prototype of the B-2?
What year was that article?
This was May 6, 1996.
Okay, that's interesting because that was right around the time that Tacit Blue was finally declassified and unveiled. So,
that's right.
Depending on when they asked the questions of the officials, they may have been referring to Tacit Blue, or it's possible there was something completely different.
Yeah, that article was part of Tacit Blue. That was what they were. So.
Yeah, and frequently you get these guys in industry making cryptic comments like that indicate there were other projects. Recently we've seen that Lockheed Martin Skunk Works has been involved in the X-56, which is a test bed to reduce wing flutter and study the effects of wing flutter and how to mitigate that. And one of the Lockheed guys who worked on that said that previously there was another program where flutter really bit them in the ass. And when you ask them, well, okay, what program was that? They can't tell you because it's still classified. And I've seen also graphics from the Skunk Works that show the history of their projects, and you see recognizable airframes, F-104, U-2, A-12, TR-1, SR-71, but then there are little skunks indicated within the time frame, along the timeline, indicating projects that they built and flew, which they cannot talk about. And there are several of these over a span from the 1980s into the 1990s. So you know that they're flying some interesting things, and we're not hearing about that.
That's right. So, Peter, in your professional assessment, did Northrop build a subscale B-2 manned?
I have no direct knowledge or even any real hints that Northrop built a subscale B-2.
Okay.
There have been rumors, there have been people who swear that they saw something along those lines flying, but I've never been able to find anything to back it up, so I don't know.
All right, okay. Peter, please comment on the original configuration of the B-2 Stealth Bomber before Northrop changed the wing design in 1983, which cost American taxpayers $1 billion.
I don't know that I was aware of the cost increase due to the redesign, but
yes.
The original studies, the original engineering studies for the B-2 looked at two different configurations. One would have been a low altitude penetrator, which essentially would be a very sharp flying triangle type aircraft. The other was a high altitude penetrator that looked very much like what they ended up with in terms of the final configuration, except that it didn't have as many sawtooth points on the trailing edge. So if you were to look at it from above, you would have a single point in the back of the fuselage, and then the two other points being the trailing edge of the wingtips. But there were some serious bending moments attributable to that shape, and there were some issues that would have involved wing flutter and possible structural deformation, which would not only affect the handling qualities of the aircraft, but also possibly its stealth characteristics, and might have led to some serious flying problems. So the shape was redesigned, adding two more points to the trailing edge. So now you've got the wingtips and 3 points in between, which maintains the stealth characteristics while adding a lot more structural strength. This, of course, increased the price of the airframe, but the real serious cost increase resulted from the fact that the government originally wanted to buy 100 airframes or more, and in the end they ordered 20. So your unit cost goes way up because you're including all the development costs within the total cost of the aircraft. And by amortizing those costs, now your per unit airframe cost goes through the roof, and it sounds totally insane when you look at the price tag for a B-2. Interesting thing is that now we have the long-range strike bomber contract. Lockheed Martin teamed up with Boeing, and Northrop Grumman submitted a design, and they won the competition. And the Air Force has finally revealed basically what that looks like. And interestingly, it looks almost identical to the original high-altitude penetrator for the Advanced Strategic Penetrating Aircraft that became the B-2. I think that the reason they're able to do that now is because we are quite a bit further down the line in terms of advanced materials technology and controls technology, and now it's possible to build that airframe without the same problems they would have had back in the 1980s when the B-2 was developed.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Peter, please describe the B-2 sub-assembly plant at Pico Rivera and what parts of the aircraft were built there.
Okay, I'm mostly going from memory here, but as I recall, the B-2, it's a Northrop product, now Northrop Grumman, but really you had a lot of different companies involved. So Northrop primarily built the cockpit section, center body area, and the edges of the whole vehicle, all along the wings, leading and trailing edges, all the stealthy radar absorbent parts. And then LTV, I believe, built, I'm trying to think now, because Boeing and LTV both got some significant parts, and of course General Electric got the engines. So if you look at a breakdown of the B-2 airframe, you'll see the cockpit and the edges are all Northrop Grumman, and then LTV and Boeing built the weapons bay and the wings, internal structures, and you've got other subcontractors with various small parts, and I think Hughes developed a radar, low probability of intercept radar.
Okay. Peter, how did the Northrop B-2 Stealth Bomber eventually end up costing $2.3 billion per aircraft, more than its own weight in gold, and how did the original order go from 132 bombers down to just 21? You kind of touched on this before.
Yeah, I did, and I don't know that I can really add anything more than what I said. The original idea was to order at least 100 B-2 stealth bombers, because they were nominally going to be a replacement for the B-52s and the B-1s. the B-52s we have flying today, the most current ones were built in like 1961, so these are ancient, but yet they're still pretty reliable. The B-1s, you know, were supposed to be a replacement for those, and yet many of them have been retired. The cost of the B-2 went up significantly when they reduced the order from 100 down to 20, because you're including all of the original development costs and testing and all the experimental stuff, along with the production costs for the current fleet. And if you were spreading that over a fleet of 100 bombers, the unit cost is going to be one thing, but if you only have 20 and you have the same amount of money being spent, now it's a much higher unit cost. And the American taxpayer doesn't like those numbers when they hear them, because it sounds like an insane price for an aircraft. This is one of the reasons why when the LRSB contract was put out, the government specified that we need this to be a much cheaper aircraft all around. And so I think that was intended to be primarily a fixed price contract, which is a little hard to do when you're developing a new airplane. But Northrop Grumman, in their proposal, submitted that they would include a lot of mature technologies that they'd already developed with the B-2 and some improvements that would help reduce the costs overall.
Okay. Peter, just as a side note, the B-2 Stealth Bomber that crashed in Guam, was that a total write-off, or did they repair that?
No. Now, there have been a couple of B-2 accidents. There was one where an aircraft was damaged pretty substantially. I don't remember the tail number right off the top of my head, but this happened in Guam on deployment, and the aircraft was given some temporary repairs to make it possible to fly it back to the United States, where the airframe went through an overhaul and was finally repaired. The other B-2, the one that crashed on takeoff at Guam, that was a different story, because they had some problem with moisture buildup in the pitot sensors and lost control of the aircraft during the takeoff roll. The plane slid in and caught fire, and the crew had bailed out by this point. It was a total write-off, because you're talking about a very large structure with a lot of composite materials, and everything burned. It was just a disaster. And so after the investigation was completed, they took the remains of that aircraft and ran it through an industrial shredder and turned it into a bunch of mush. And that was the end of that.
Wow. Okay. Wow, that's interesting. Okay. So bottom line is we're down to 20 B-2s now, right?
Right. They had started out, you know, once they had the finalized fleet numbers for the B-2, to go with 20 aircraft. And they ended up with 21, but number 21 was also number 1. It was a test airframe that was subsequently overhauled to the point where it could be an operational aircraft. But then they lost the one on Guam, so you know, now we're down one.
Okay. Peter, please describe the B-2 final assembly building at Air Force Plant 42. How were sub-assembly components shipped from Pico Rivera, and what level of security existed inside the facility?
You know, I don't know any of the answers to those questions. I've never been in the B-2 manufacturing facility at Palmdale. You know, I had heard that some of the parts were shipped by rail, but I don't really know that for sure. That was just some reports I read years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Peter, can you just give us a verbal tour of Air Force Plant 42? What aerospace companies have facilities there?
Yeah. Air Force Plant 42 is it's known as a government-owned contractor-operated facility, or GOCO. And essentially, you have the Air Force having responsibility. It's one of several Air Force plants where they do manufacturing and testing. And it has recently been put under the overall control of the Air Force Test Center, which is headquartered at Edwards Air Force Base, and which oversees test activities all around the country. Plant 42 has a number of facilities which are called sites. And so you'll have Site 1, which is Lockheed Martin, and Site 2 is also Lockheed Martin. That's where they do the U-2 overhaul and refurbishment. The entire fleet of U-2 aircraft goes through there, basically being broken down and rebuilt and modified as necessary. The Site 1 facility, which is Lockheed Plant 10, I believe, is where they do some of the spooky skunkworks stuff, developing new prototypes, including recently there was a hybrid airship and some unmanned aerial vehicles such as the Polecat, which was a demonstrator that made a few flights and then crashed, and the RQ-170, which I imagine started out as the P-170, since that's the way Lockheed numbers their vehicles, but when it became operational, they gave it an RQ designation as an unmanned aerial reconnaissance platform. Northrop Grumman has Site 4, where they work on the X-47B and the B-2, and presumably will also be working on the new B-21, since they're going to be manufacturing that in Palmdale. There's a Site 6, which was used by the 410th Flight Test Squadron when they had the F-117s come out of the black world into the white world. That has now been inactivated, and they're using it for other purposes now. And Site 9 has been leased by NASA for airborne science programs, including a DC-8 flying laboratory, the SOFIA Airborne Observatory, and ER-2, which is the civilian version of the U-2, used for Earth resources monitoring.
Okay. What about Rockwell International, Peter? Do they have anything?
Rockwell International used to have a site, and for a while they were building B-1Bs, and that was at Site 9, which is now NASA, so that's gone. Boeing purchased the Rockwell facility on the other side of the field where they were refurbishing and modifying space shuttle orbiters. And as far as I know, that's still a Boeing facility, although I haven't seen any activity there in a while since the space shuttle was retired.
Okay. Peter, so you didn't get a chance to attend the rollout ceremony of the B-2 on November 22nd, 1988, huh?
No, I missed both the rollout and first flight of the B-2, I'm sad to say.
Oh, really? Okay. You weren't here?
Yeah, I was not around for that.
Okay.
The B-2, when it was first rolled out, its first public appearance, previously there had been some, not particularly accurate artist concepts of what it was going to look like. But they finally rolled out the actual airframe, and it was all very well orchestrated. They had the plane in a hangar with the doors closed and set up a bunch of bleachers in front of the hangar so that the VIP guests could see the plane rolled out. And it was designed in such a way that they would be able only to see the airplane from the front. And at that time, the trailing edge and the upper surface, particularly the exhaust deck with the engines, was somewhat sensitive, and Northrop and the Air Force didn't really want anybody looking at that. So they opened up the hangar doors, tow the B-2 out with great fanfare, and at that point, a small airplane flew overhead, which had been rented by Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. And Mike Dornheim got some fantastic pictures looking straight down at the B-2, getting its plan form for the first time, and seeing the exhaust deck details on the trailing edge. So in terms of security, the Air Force had created a wonderful fortress, but like Fortress Europe in World War II, they built it without a roof.
Okay, great. Peter, the B-2 was originally billed as the first paperless airplane. The January 1989 issue of InterAvia indicated that Northrop developed their own CAD system called NCAD. What happened to all the 400 NCAD workstations and mainframe computers Northrop used to set up their network during the design and manufacturing process?
I'm not sure what happened with all the NCAD equipment and, in fact, all of the documentation and material that went into development of the B-2. When you look at some of these programs, like the B-2 and also Northrop's YF-23, things that were developed with a high degree of sensitivity because of their advanced technology characteristics. It's sad to say that a lot of that documentation and material and equipment was simply destroyed later.
Wow. Okay, so we've lost a major portion of our national history then, right?
Right. For instance, with the YF-23 was a competition for the Advanced Tactical Fighter against Lockheed's YF-22. These were technology demonstrators to prove the concept of a modern generation fighter, which would have low observability, like the early stealth aircraft, but significantly improved to the point where you can design an airplane that looks more like an airplane. It has more of an aerodynamic and conventional shape, and yet it still is virtually invisible to radar. And Northrop had a very good design in the YF-23. It was beautiful, it worked well, for whatever reason, and you'll get different stories depending on who you talk to. Some said it was lost due to politics, some said it wasn't as technically good as the YF-22. We may not have that answer because a great deal of material, more than 10 pallets worth of documentation on that program, the YF-23, were simply shredded.
Really?
So, all gone. All that history, all that data, just gone. And that, sad to say, is something that's typical because it's very expensive to maintain classified material appropriately. It has to be locked in vaults, it has to be handled in certain ways, and this costs a lot of money. And if the company doesn't see any particular benefit to holding on to that, it's simply disposed of.
Okay, so since we're on this subject, Peter, where do you personally feel all of the unknown Lockheed designs are stored? The blueprints, the diagrams, the drawings, conceptual artwork, where do they keep all of that material for the programs they've never acknowledged?
I would love to know where Lockheed Skunk Works stores all their nifty files on designs that we have yet to see. It's possible that they keep them in a vault somewhere. But it's equally possible that a lot of that stuff has simply been lost due to being destroyed. In the 1980s, for instance, Lockheed was still working under a system developed by Kelly Johnson where you did not mark classified material as classified. And that was simply because if something were to happen where a document was seen by an unauthorized person, if it's just a boring looking document, people won't pay attention to it. But if it's got a big secret stamp on the front, then it doesn't matter how boring it really is, the person who sees it is going to want to read it. It's just human nature. So Lockheed wasn't marking their material as classified. And during the F-117 program, the Air Force came in and did an inspection. They said, you're not handling this stuff appropriately. Everything needs to be marked, everything needs to be stored in the proper vault, it needs to be handled the proper way. And so a lot of stuff, if it was absolutely necessary to the program, they marked it and stored it. And if it wasn't, and that included a lot of historic material that they'd been keeping, they just shredded it. There's an example of one engine